All right, folks. Is Nigel here? Oh. Nigel Hickson is joining us. Needs very little introduction. Vice President at ICANN before, yes. And now you're with the UK government with the, I tried to memorize it, digital?
Department of Culture. Media.
Maybe I'll give him a microphone. What do you think?
DCMS.
Department of Science, Innovation and Technology.
Of course, it rebranded. Yes.
Right, well, good afternoon. I haven't got any slides. No. No slides. No slides. Do some of those want to come in? I'm handing out free government grants, you know. Yeah. You know, the UK government loves to hand out money. I don't think. Let's just wait 1 second to see if anyone wants to come in. Yeah, I mean, I didn't see any chocolates or drinks out there yet, you know, but...
Closed out the coffee.
Yeah, the coffee must be very good. Or it might be the conversation. Anyway, let's start. So, my name's Nigel Hickson. I work for the UK government. I mean, someone has to. I work in a team at the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, which used to... so we were in DCMS, the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and now there's a new government department called the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, which deals with digital issues. And as kindly said, I used to work for ICANN as well. I'm a long-term civil servant, but I left the civil service in 2012 and joined ICANN for 8 years, and then ICANN decided they didn't want me anymore, which was okay, you know. It's one of those things in life, isn't it? And so I came back in 2020 to the UK, and I joined the government again. So it's a delight to be with you. I was here last year briefly, well, not here, in Putney, was it last year? And it was great to come along last year as well, and to meet with many people here. So, what am I going to talk about today? Well, really 3 things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a bit about what the UK is doing in terms of your market and what various measures are that we're taking that could affect your market. I'll then say a bit about ICANN. Who's heard of ICANN? Well, I think, yeah, good. Well, that's a good start. Kieran's obviously heard of ICANN. He's a great lover of ICANN. It's good to see fans of ICANN here. I'll tell you a bit about what ICANN's doing in your area as well. And then I'll talk about a couple of global developments that could affect this sort of market. I won't talk for long, and if you want to interrupt me, please do. All government civil servants have to be interrupted. You know, we always open ourselves to interruption. Ministers, some ministers don't like to be interrupted too much, but you know, mere civil servants, we love to be interrupted. So, first of all, the UK. So, the government is very pro-innovation. As you know, we're very, very keen to see innovation in the domain name space. It's great to see that companies like yourselves here trading and reselling and buying domains. It's great to see this value in the domain name sector. One of the legislative changes that's coming up is something called the enactment of, and I've got it here, let's get this right, you know, always get things right, or something like that. Sections 19 to 21 of the 2010 Digital Economy Act. Who's heard of the Digital Economy Act? Wow, that's very sad that anyone's heard of this. So, back in 2010, do you remember 2010? I know it's a bit of a long time ago. The government in the Digital Economy Act took reserve powers. Reserve powers are when you put something in a piece of legislation and you think, well, it might be useful in the future. We'll just put it in the legislation. We won't necessarily enact it, but we'll just put it in the legislation. It's useful to be there. And the government took reserve powers to potentially regulate Nominet, or that was the sort of intention at the time, the .uk domain name. In other words, the administrator of the .uk domain name, which is Nominet, as you heard from Kieran. Reserve powers were taken in 2010. And this was essentially done in order to protect .uk in case Nominet got into trouble or got taken over by interests that weren't conducive to the broader use of .uk. So that's what these powers were taken for. And lo and behold, for good reason or bad reason, the government has now decided to enact those powers. So there's now a public consultation on the enactment of those powers in sections 19 to 21 of the Digital Economy Act. And the reason that's important, I think, is that it's a national government taking powers to regulate a country code, which is .uk, but also some generic top-level domains, because the way the legislation was written in 2010, it talked about UK-related domains, which at the time was just .uk. But of course, in 2012, we saw the expansion of the domain name space under ICANN. We saw the expansion of, back in 2011 or early 2012, I think there were 22 generic top-level domains. And during 2012 and 2013, that has now grown to over 1,500. And some of those domains are UK-related. We have .scot, we have .wales, we have .comru, and we have .london. And these are the so-called UK-related domains. That's what the lawyers tell us. So also those generic top-level domains are going to come under this regulation. And I think it's important just to say a couple of words about this. The consultation on this legislation is now out, and I can send a link so everyone can understand it. But what this legislation does, it takes, as I said, reserve powers to effectively regulate these UK domains. And they are reserve powers, so it's not regulation of a day-to-day nature. It doesn't mean that the owners of these UK domains have to, walk into our building or whatever and pay us money every day, or that would be a good idea. But nothing like that at all. These are reserve powers that would only be enacted in certain circumstances. And these circumstances fall into two areas. First of all, if these domains, .uk, .london, etc., did not take notice of standards of DNS abuse protection. In other words, if these registries were found to be lax in their application of rules on things like phishing and botnets and farming, etc., then the government could take reserve powers. And those requirements are, malware, botnets, farming, and phishing. And also those registries have to have procedures in place to deal with child abuse images, CSAM material. So those are the requirements. And fortunately, the way the consultation is drafted, although that's for you to determine, we're pretty confident that these UK-related domains, especially .uk, Nominet, as Kieran said, Nominet runs an extremely good registry. I mean, you might have other issues with Nominet, but they do, as Kieran said, run an extremely tight and secure registry. And these other domains are also well run. So we don't think there's any issues there. But it does mean that if one of these registries was seen not to be upholding these standards, then they might fall foul of this regulation. And the second category, which I think is more interesting, is potentially more controversial. The consultation documents also talks about unfair use. Now, I love the word unfair use because, what's unfair to some person is not necessarily unfair to someone else. But unfair use of a domain name is in terms of this proposed legislation, is defined in this legislation as cyber typo squatting. Now, we know what cyber squatting is. You know what cyber squatting is? So in other words, so if the registry was found to be not enacting sufficient measures to try and prevent cyber squatting, then they could fall in contravention of these powers. And also typo setting. So typo setting is where someone deliberately registers a domain with a slight change in the word. So instead of Barclays with 2 C's, you might have Barclays with, say, 3 C's or 1 C. Instead of Barclays with 1 C, you would have Barclays with 2 C's or 2 Y's, or not a very good example, I know. But in other words, this sort of, the registering of domains which are clearly being registered to confuse and misdirect customers, misdirect users of those domains, so they would go to some other page for marketing purposes or some other purposes, not necessarily criminal purposes or anything like that. You could just register a domain name that simply was used for your own marketing purposes and hope by misspelling someone else's domain name, sufficient people would click on your name and go through to it to generate traffic and therefore bring you an income. Now, I think this is potentially fairly controversial because this isn't something which is defined, as I understand it, in the ICANN contracts. As you know, ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, has contracts with registries and registrars, and in those contracts it spells out the conditions under which those top-level domains are used. And I don't think this typo squatting is mentioned anywhere at all. So the fact that the government are proposing to introduce this requirement that registries must, if you like, have processes in place to try and prevent this. I mean, presumably you can't ever prevent it entirely, but the registries would have to have provisions in place to try and prevent that type of squatting. So it'll be interesting to get your views on that. Because what's interesting about it, to me anyway, is that we've all seen this, and some of us I know are older than others here, but we know what happens when something is introduced for just a few domains, it's picked up, and then it could be introduced for a lot more domains. So what is applicable today in the UK for .uk and .scot and .wales and .cymru could well be then taken up in a wider sense. So that I think is fairly interesting. So the consultation on these proposed new powers runs until the 31st of August, and I'll make sure that people attending this get a link to that consultation. So yeah, I mean, have a look at it and say it's a load of whatever if you want. I mean, this is I shouldn't stand here as a government spokesman saying please criticise proposed UK legislation, but I will. Because that's what it's all about. That's what civil servants should be doing. We should be coming here, we should be saying, well, the government are thinking of doing this, there's a consultation, and we want your views. We want your views, whether they're critical, whether they're supportive, or whatever. Because the implications of some of this are potentially impactful, if you like, for the industry. So please, please give us your views, especially on things where unfair use is involved. So I won't say anything more about the Digital Economy Act. That's a consultation on running. You also might have seen that the Home Office have recently consulted on some new powers under the Computer Misuse Act to expand the law enforcement, if you like, the law enforcement or the ability of law enforcement authorities to investigate the use of domain names in a criminal way. So there's consultation under the Computer Misuse Act, and also the Home Office are going to be proposing guidance. We think they are. We're in discussions with them on. I mean, this is a Home Office idea, not our idea. This is the Home Office producing guidance for the industry. And it's very wide-ranging. The scope of the guidance is on terrorist-related material, but it applies to the DNS sector in general. So it's not just for registries and registrars or resellers or sellers or whatever. It applies across the industry. And it's essentially guidance. It's not legislation, but it will be guidance on, if you like, how the industry should react to terrorism content or content on terrorism issues. So that's enough on the UK. But please, ask me questions afterwards or whatever of what we're doing. What I should have mentioned is that I work in a very small team in the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology on internet governance issues. So our role in this small team is to represent the UK on internet governance policy. So I'm the UK representative on the Government Advisory Committee at ICANN. The Government Advisory Committee at ICANN is part of that multi-stakeholder community that generates policies to do with generic top-level domains. And the Government Advisory Committee has about 180 governments, and we represent the UK on that. And I'm also involved in other international issues like the Internet Governance Forum and the OECD and a number of other initiatives like the G7 and that. So that's what we do. We represent the UK on internet governance issues, but we also have extensive consultation within the UK with the industry, and that's why I come along to meet people here. It's really excellent. So on the Government Advisory Committee, as I said, we advise ICANN on public policy issues, and if governments say to ICANN, well, we think this policy doesn't really reflect public policy issues, then ICANN generally listen to what the governments say. And there's just two issues I wanted to touch on that ICANN are working on, and one of these is on DNS abuse. DNS abuse has become very important for governments with good reasons because of the effect it has on citizens and the lack of trust or the diminution of trust that it places in terms of the use of the internet. And ICANN has been responding to this pressure to do more about DNS abuse, phishing and botnets and malware, etc. And they're in the process at the moment of amending the contracts that they have with registrars and registries. So as you know, that if you sell generic top-level domains, if you're a registrar, then you have a contract with ICANN. If you're a registry for a generic top-level domain, then you have a contract with ICANN. And these contracts are being amended so that they entail the requirement of those registries and registrars to better cooperate with the law enforcement authorities and actually follow up some of the complaints they get on phishing, botnets, etc., etc. In our view, in the government's view, ICANN has been far too lax in the enforcement of some of these contracts in terms of DNS abuse. Far too lax indeed, and these contract requirements might help solve some of the problems. Now, these contract requirements are only for registrars and registries, but they could also be applied to resellers and sellers of domain names in the future. There's pressure from the Government Advisory Committee, from some governments, to extend the reach of these contracts so they bind sellers and resellers of domain names as well. So that's one issue that ICANN is grappling with. The other issue, of course, is the new round for generic top-level domains. Who's heard of SubPro? ICANN comes up with the greatest of acronyms. I think there are people in Los Angeles, where ICANN is based, that sit in their offices all day and just come up with acronyms. What should we call this next? So rather than calling it a new round of generic top-level domains, they can't have that because they called the last round a new round in 2012. They've called it the subsequent procedures. So essentially, there's been a big policy development and a lot of preparation, and preparation is still going on. And this work has started in about 2017 or something, or 2016 probably, and is still going on. And it's going to take 10 years, well, not 10 years from now, but the next round for generic top-level domains will be, you heard it from me first, will be in the first quarter of 2026. Now, I'll be retired by then, so you won't be able to say Nigel got it completely wrong. But that's what ICANN are telling us. That's what the policy development process or the implementation review process is pointing to, a new application round in 2026. And that, of course, is very important for a lot of people. There's a lot of registrars and registrars here today that will be thinking whether they might have customers, whether they might have clients that want new generic top-level domains. On the other hand, they might be saying, let's forget it. Some domain names that were brought out in 2012 have never made money, others have collapsed, etc. So it's not, it's not a guaranteed way to make a lot of money having a new top-level domain. But, some have been successful, and no doubt there'll be applications from brand names. A number of companies that want to protect their brands didn't do so back in 2012 because either they didn't know about it or whatever, and they might want to do so. So we have brands at the moment like the .bbc or .bp or .shell, etc., and other brands might want to protect their brands. We might have other geographical names. As I said, we have .london at the moment. We have .scot, we have .berlin, we have .brussels, we have .paris. What about Guildford? Or what about Scunthorpe? Or what about it? Or what about Newcastle? Or what about, I'm just being provocative here. You might think, well, my little village ought to have a domain name, or your big village, or whatever. So the geographical names and, of course, generic names as well, people might apply for as well. So the new round is an opportunity for innovation. It's also an opportunity to have more international domain names. We want domain names to be applied for in different scripts, not just Latin scripts, and Chinese scripts, in Hindu scripts, in Arabic scripts, in Cyrillic scripts, etc., etc. Widening the use of domain names from the West to, globally. So we want international domain names to be applied for. We want more African countries to apply for domain names. It was the last round was a failure in many respects. The last generic top-level domain name round in 2012 was a failure. How many applications were there from the continent of Africa? What do you think? I've told you there were roughly 1,700 applications for new generic top-level domains. So how many do you think came from Africa?
4. 2.
4. 5. 4. Well, only 2 were approved, I think, in the end. But I think there was about 4 applications or something like that. So it was a failure, despite the fact that ICANN staff were out, treading the boards in Africa. There were only a few applications, and the same for different parts of South America were very badly represented. So this time round, we as the governments are saying ICANN have got to spend some of their money on actually getting out there and trying to get applications from the global south, because unless ICANN does this, then it's not really representative, is it? I mean, we don't, it's great to have lots of US and European companies protecting their brands, but you want applications from across the world. So that's all I'll say on that, but 2026 looks likely. And finally, let me just touch on a couple of things, because we in Europe, we in the UK, for your businesses, we take the global internet for granted. I mean, who's got teenagers as children or what? I mean, the internet has become, and it's great that it's become, something like electricity, something like gas, something like whatever. It's become not a right, it's not a human right, although there are proposals that would make internet access a human right in Geneva. It's not a human right, but it's become something that we all rely on. and we take it for granted that the internet is global. Okay, you know, there are exceptions. If we've got, you know, colleagues or relatives in North Korea, then, you know, we know that there are issues. We know that there are issues in other parts of the world where the internet does not reach, or those governments have switched off the internet or interfered with the internet in some way. But generally, the internet is global. But there are global pressures that might well mean that the internet fragments within the next 5 to 10 years. Those pressures are coming from some countries. The BRICS countries are going to meet this week in South Africa. On their agenda will be the internet. The BRICS countries, when they met, this is Brazil, Russia, India, when they met 2 or 3 years ago, they released a statement saying the way, and we want a new way of managing the internet, or a new internet. I mean, that's to paraphrase. It wasn't exactly like that. Therefore, there are still global pressures that could fragment the internet. And these discussions are taking place, as I said, within the BRICS companies. They also will there'll also be discussions at the UN during the discussions on the Global Digital Compact. The Global Digital Compact is a digital initiative from the UN Secretary General, looking across the board at sustainability, accessibility, and affordability on the internet, or digital issues. It's a very, you know, wide-ranging document, but part of it's on internet governance, and already Russia and 1 or 2 other countries have said they want to use the Global Digital Compact, or the discussions on the Global Digital Compact, to re-engineer the way the governance of the internet is currently taken forward. So in other words, they want to look again at the establishment of ICANN in 1997, the establishment of the regional internet registries, and the general private sector global internet DNS that you're involved in. So that's going to take place next year. There'll be discussions at the UN next year on that. And in 2025 will be the 20th anniversary of the so-called WSIS process. In 2005, at the World Summit on the Information Society, a document was released called the Tunis Agenda. I remember being there, not really understanding what much of this was about. And this document essentially codified the way the governance of the internet should be managed. It said that the private sector should be involved in the day-to-day running of the internet. It said there's a role for civil society in the management of the internet. It talked about the role of the technical community, and it talked about the role of governments in terms of public policy. That whole, if you like, deal that was signed off in 2005 is going to be coming up for debate at the UN General Assembly at the end of 2025, so a couple of years' time. And that, again, could lead to further UN action that could essentially split the internet. The internet will continue in the way we know it, but a new internet will be developed by those countries that were unhappy with the multi-stakeholder approach. So there's a lot of things on the global agenda as well, which you should keep your eye on. And I'll finish there. But any questions, delighted to try and address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Wonderful to hear from you, as always. Any questions?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Nigel. My name is Georgia Osborne. I just have a question. Thank you so much for your talk. I just have a question about, you mentioned 3 consultations, one of which is current. I think there's one that you talked about that was relevant around terrorism and also the DNS. Is that the IPA? Is that the Investigatory Powers Act one, or is there something I'm not sure of?
Yeah, so there's a consultation on the Investigatory Powers Act, which is obviously to do with law enforcement, including terrorism as issue. No, this is separate guidance that the Home Office are thinking of producing So this isn't a legislative vehicle. This, what I mentioned, was separate guidance, and there's been a consultation on new powers under the Computer Misuse Act as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for those perspectives. So, I'm not sure you were here earlier when I was making the presentation on behalf of Kenya.
.ke.
.ke, fantastic. So the Kenya government now is doing the digital economy push. To what extent can your department, or is your department involved then in sort of digital economy diplomacy? We get a lot of diplomacy on other fronts, but I would like to just know whether the UK government is also paying attention to that side of things.
No, absolutely we are. So we in our department work very closely with our Foreign Commonwealth and Development Organisation, the FCDO, and Kenya is one of the countries among a number of other African countries where we have developed the so-called Digital Access Programme. This is a programme to enhance internet connectivity and connections to the internet. And so yeah, we take we take this very seriously. My colleague in my team is one of my colleagues is going to the Africa IGF, the Internet Governance Forum in Nigeria. Nigeria in a few weeks' time. So yes, and we work closely through the International Telecommunications Union, through the ITU with African countries and the African Union. So I think, yeah, I mean, digital diplomacy is obviously a big issue, and we recognise, and when I talked about the fact that there were only so many applications from Africa, I mean, no one is pretending this is easy, and applications for new generic top-level domains cost money. Therefore, we're ensuring that ICANN have a program where the application fees are waived for certain applications from African countries. But even that in itself, I mean, just because you waive the application fee, there's the running of a generic top-level domain, the back-end services, et cetera, et cetera. So we recognize that none of these things are trivial. But good luck with .ke. It's fantastic. I mean, yeah. I think this.
So you spoke about, I actually have a few questions.
Can you just...
I'm Joe Alanya, I'm with IT.com.
IT?
I'm with IT.com.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Pretty successful, I hear.
Yeah, we're making progress. We're very excited. So I have a couple of questions. One is, what makes you so confident that 2027 is the date?
Well, I said 2026, but...
2026. Yeah, I'm really curious. Like, I follow ICANN, and I just haven't heard anybody say that as confidently as you are.
All right. Well, that's why and I'll retire tomorrow. But no, so there's been a policy development process, as you know. There's something called an implementation review team process, which is working on, if you like, writing something called the application guidebook.
Right.
Now, the application guidebook is a book. I mean, it will be a book. It will be, well, hopefully it'll be online as well. But it will, and that, if you like, contains all the rules and regulations under which people apply for names. That process is reckoned to take another 18 months. There'll then be a 6-month process to get all the IT systems in place to actually launch the round. Okay. And both the CEO and the chair of the board of ICANN recently put out a blog saying, if you add all the bits together, it comes to the first
2026. You talked about typo squatting. Are there any strict definitions about that? Now, first of all, I must precede my question with that I'm no fan of any kind of squatting. But I'm also concerned about government regulation about things like that, because what's the difference between, how do you define typo squatting? I mean, would a new entrepreneur not have a right for example, to name their company, I don't know, I'm just going to pick out of the blue, say delta.com, and they wanted belta.com. Is that typo squatting, or can I name my company belta.com?
Yeah. Well, I think typo squatting is one of the real difficulties, but the government have decided to at least put it in the consultation document for these powers, and I would have thought it will, in the end. At the moment, the definition is just the registration of a name for the purposes of deliberately misleading users of that domain name.
Are you saying that the let's say the qualification for determining whether it was what the intent behind it, is it what they do with the name or what they put on the
or what
domain
the intent
name?
is? So the way, as I say, the way the consultation document is written, it's the intent.
There has to be some evidence of intent.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
because you can't assume that somebody that has a letter off or a number off has an intent.
No.
They might have a perfectly.
No, I'm completely with you on this, having been involved in this area for a number of years. I mean, we want innovation in this space. We want companies to register their names, and we also want registrations globally. So who would necessarily know that there was a company in existence that had already registered, a name that was similar to another name? So I think, this is an area that's going to have to be worked on. But yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Let's take a break now, and then we'll have our final panel of the evening. Sorry, we're out of time for questions, but Nigel will be here today and tomorrow?
Well, certainly today and bits of tomorrow. Hopefully.
Wonderful. So let's take a break, and we'll reconvene hopefully in about 5 minutes for a panel on domain monetization. Thank you so much, Nigel.
Thank you.